Hello and welcome to this introduction to drawing with charcoal with me, Richard Rochester. I'm an artist based in Devon. I've been working quite extensively with charcoal over the last few years. I've made a lot of mistakes, I've learned a lot, and over the next hour or so I'm hoping to share some of my learning with you so that you can go away and produce some really good charcoal drawings. In a moment we're going to take a look at some of the kit and equipment that we use when producing charcoal drawings, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about paper as well, which is an important factor. After that I'm going to set up a simple still life from which I'm going to take an image. That image will be available to you via a link, so you'll be able to print that off at home. It will have a grid overlaid onto it, and that will enable you to scale it up to whatever size piece of paper you want to work onto. I'll show you how to do that when we come to that point. And then we'll work through drawing together from start to finish, and at the end I'll show you how to fix it properly using fixative to preserve it for the future. So without further ado, let's have a look at what charcoal actually is. So I'm going to start with natural charcoal. This is what most people will be familiar with from school or art classes. It's just a stick of willow that has been cooked in an oxygen-starved environment. Drawing charcoal isn't always willow. Sometimes it can be other woods, linden wood or grapevine, but generally here in the UK it tends to be willow, and we do produce some of the world's finest charcoal here in the UK. The sticks normally come in lengths a little bit shorter than a pencil. They're normally a little bit longer than that, but I've been working with this one. They come in a variety of thicknesses. You can get a sort of medium one like that. They come in thicker lengths, and you can get very thin ones, and you can also get very thick ones as well. And it's really just a case of choosing the thickness of charcoal that's appropriate to the drawing project that you're working on. So let's just have a very quick look at the qualities of charcoal as a medium. Again, you're probably mostly all familiar with this, but it produces a beautiful dark grey, a lovely velvety dark grey, very matte. Charcoal is a natural charcoal, I should say, is a dry pigment. It's effectively dust and particles, and those particles are loosened when you draw on the paper, and those loose particles can then be worked into the surface of the paper to produce these lovely grey tones. Now there are some pros and cons to charcoal. On the downside, it wears down very quickly, so it's very difficult to hold a point for any length of time, so it's hard to do thin lines with charcoal. It also breaks very easily if you're not careful. You can snap your charcoal and that can be problematic. The other issue is that it's quite easy to smudge and smear by accident when you're working, and that's something that you need to be careful of. On the other hand, a great strength of willow charcoal is that it's relatively easy to remove it from the paper once you've drawn it on there, and that enables us to work in reverse, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment when we come on to looking at erasers and where they come into drawing with charcoal. So that's natural charcoal. There's another natural charcoal product that's of interest. That's willow charcoal charcoal powder. This is effectively just charcoal that's been ground down to very, very, very fine powder. You can buy it in different sized tubs. This comes from Coates, a family firm in Somerset producing some of the world's finest charcoal. I often decant mine into small spice jars, such as this, or icing sugar containers, and then you can simply apply it to your drawing. And the beauty of it is that you can then produce lovely even greys without danger of scratching the paper. And you don't want to scratch the paper, because if you do, you have a line that is very hard to erase. I don't know if you can see that there. Maybe not very clear. Let's just do another one here. There we go. Now you might say, well, why should I scratch my paper, or why would I scratch my paper? But the fact is that sticks of charcoal, because they are literally sticks, they often have little knots of harder wood in them, and you may not be aware that that's there, and you can quite easily accidentally scratch the paper. That's particularly true of the thicker pieces, but I'll talk a bit more about how we avoid scratching the paper later. But one thing you can do, as I say, is to use this charcoal powder. As you can probably also tell from the way it came out of the jar, it's just a beautiful medium in its own right, and there's lots you could do to play with that and experiment and to produce wonderful things. So get some and play with it and get creative, and I'm sure many of you will come up with some fantastic results. So that's charcoal powder. Next we're going to come on to what we call compressed charcoals. Now compressed charcoals aren't the same as natural charcoals. Compressed charcoals are charcoal powder that's been bound up with some sort of binder, such as resins or waxes, and different manufacturers use different binders, and that enables them to produce a sort of hard block of medium with charcoal in it. You can buy it literally in blocks like this that produce a very dark, almost black pigment, quite a lot darker than what you can achieve with the charcoal. And because they can form into blocks as well, they can make the core of a pencil. And this type is literally just like a pencil within a wooden pencil housing that you can then sharpen. I tend to use a craft knife to sharpen it rather than a pencil sharpener, because the core is a bit thicker than a normal pencil, and you'll just waste that very expensive core if you just use a normal pencil sharpener. It will still work, of course, but my preferred way is to use a craft knife. This type is slightly different. This is effectively paper wrapped around the core, and you just unravel the paper to reveal the core. So compressed charcoal gives that nice black, as I say, and it sticks to the paper much more effectively than natural charcoal. And that, again, is a double-edged sword. It can be very useful to us, but it's also less desirable if you want to try and remove some of the medium, either to lighten up the tonal value of the area you're working, or indeed to get back to the white for highlights and what have you. So we've got to think very carefully about when we use compressed charcoal and how. So coming back to that point about natural charcoal being a medium that is relatively easy to remove once it's on there, the next thing I'm going to talk about is erasers, because just as you can draw a dark line onto a light background with charcoal, you can draw a light line onto a dark background with erasers. And this is just an ordinary art eraser. It's a bit mucky now because I have my mucky fingers on it, but believe me, it started off white. You can get all sorts of different erasers. I'm sure you've all got them in your art kits already. These ones are like a clutch pencil. You can also get very thin ones. You get the putty rubber, the putty rubbers that come like a block of blue tack, and those can be worked with your fingers until they get warm and malleable and sticky. I quite like to use just the rubber on the end of a pencil. The extra length means you can sort of be a little bit more expressive sometimes, and you can also just trim off the edge of the rubber to make it sharp, to produce a very thin line. And finally, let's have a quick look at this, which is an electric eraser. Great for sort of expressive mark making, and also for just getting back to near the colour of your surface. So those are it's worth having a few different erasers in your kit. Before moving away from this now, I just want to look very quickly at what is sometimes known as white charcoal, because you may have come across this, or tinted charcoal. Of course, it's not charcoal, but it is a white dry pigment that can be used alongside charcoal, and it may be used for highlights, or it might be used for drawing over a paper that is already coloured or tinted. So that's something I want to play with. Personally, I don't like to use those for my highlights because I like to use the white of the paper, if my paper is white, but they may be worth playing with for you in what you're doing. Now I'm going to look at blending tools. Blending's not an important part of drawing with charcoal because you quite often want to sort of smooth out lines that you may have drawn. If you've done a hatching, an area of cross hatching, for example, you may want to smooth that into an even area of value. You can also use it in areas of transition where you're going from a darker to light area, and you can even sort of pick charcoal off the paper with it. So those are useful. These are paper stumps or blending stumps. You also get what you call tortillons, which are look very much like this, but they're wraps of paper also to produce a point, and they can also be used for getting into nooks and crannies and just blending. So worth having a few different size blending stumps. You can also have a cloth in your kit as well, very handy for lightening areas, moving the charcoal around the paper, manipulating the medium. This is bamboo cloth, and bamboo cloth can be bought in rolls as an alternative to kitchen rolls. It's a little bit more expensive, but it can be reused. Once you put it through a washing machine, it becomes really super soft, so that's really nice to have. You can also use tissue paper, of course, and you can use chamois leather as well if you want to go up market. So that's also worth having in your kit. Before moving on from blending, let's just take a quick look at brushes. These are also, you've probably all got some brushes in your kits at home. Worth having one or two of those to hand. They're just great sometimes for getting into little nooks and crannies, or for producing little effects. So worth having a few brushes in your kit. Sanding blocks next. Let's have a quick look at these. These again, you've probably seen these in your kits. These are used for honing the end of your piece of charcoal to make it to give it a bit of a point, so you can get a narrower line. You can buy them like that. You can also get them in this sort of format, and of course they're also very useful for just cleaning up your blending stump as well. So sandpaper useful to have. If you haven't got those, you can just get a bit of sandpaper from the garage if you have some. And if you haven't got that, you can of course just work it on the edge of the paper until you get it to the shape that you want it. A craft knife is also useful to have for sharpening your pencils. So that's worth having too. And then finally, let's just have a quick look at this, which is a drawing board. This is just a piece of old plywood that's been sanded down so it's nice and smooth, so I don't get any imperfections coming up through the paper when I'm drawing. You can use anything really, a bit of MDF would be absolutely fine, so just find yourself a bit of board. That's really handy, then you can move it around while you're working on a drawing to work on it from different angles. You can pick it up and prop it up so you can step back and see it from a distance, which is always worth doing with a drawing. You should do that habitually. You can also take it outside and fix it. So drawing board's important, and some paper tape to secure your piece of paper to the drawing board so that it's not moving around all over the place. Because actually you're going to work on the paper quite vigorously at times, or we are when we do the drawing. So it needs to be nicely firmly taped down so we can do that work later. And the last thing I want to talk about is the paper itself. The type of paper you use makes an enormous difference in charcoal drawing. A good paper, good quality paper, has what we call tooth. A tooth is effectively lots of little nooks and crannies in the weave of the paper that hold the pigment and allow you to build up a darker tone. A smooth paper, such as a piece of paper from your printer, for example, will not hold charcoal very well. If you do a little experiment at home, you'll find that if you try and draw with charcoal onto a piece of cheap paper from your printer, it will more or less rub off to virtually just being a very light grey, virtually a white. That's partly because the paper's coated, but it's also because it hasn't got those qualities we look for in a good art paper. Now I'm going to be using a decent cartridge paper today, but there are other papers that are particularly good for charcoal drawing. So you might want to try some watercolour paper or some pastel paper, or indeed some paper specifically made for charcoal drawing. Now those are quite expensive, some of those papers, so you might want to use them with caution, but once you've found one that really works for you, you probably will want to stick with it, because you will, if you do some little comparisons between the papers you've got, you'll realise very quickly that there's a big difference between a good paper and a bad paper, and along with that, obviously the results that you're going to get when you do your drawing. So that's really, I've really covered all the basic kit and equipment you might want to use when you're doing charcoal drawing. There's some other things out there on the market, but I don't think that we need to go into any of those now. Those are all the rudimentary bits. So what we're going to move on to now is setting up a simple still life, and then we can hopefully get our image done and start the actual drawing. So here's the image I produced from my little still life. Now I just want to say a few words about still life before we move on. It's a great way to practice your drawing. You can grab a few things from around the house, make up a little composition as I have here, and you can practice your observational drawing, or you can take an image like this and work it up into a drawing. So the reason I selected these pears and the piece of wood was because I wanted some organic objects which don't present us with any challenges with regard to measuring or perspective. I don't want to go into that in this. What we want to achieve today is to understand how to look at tonal value and assess whether something is lighter or darker, and how we achieve those variations in tonal value on the paper with the tools that we've got. So I was after a high contrast image. I had a single light source over to the right hand side. I blocked out all the other light sources, so I've got a single light source giving us these highlights and then these deep shadows on the left hand side, and then I've moved the background quite close as well, so I have some shadows thrown onto the back there and here, and there are lots of little interesting things going on throughout this drawing. We've got bits such as this stalk where one side's lighter than the background and one side's darker than the background. We've got light against dark here and dark against light, same. We've got some lovely shadows here. We've got some areas where the background more or less merges in to the shadow of the actual pears themselves. So lots to deal with. I'm going to do quite a rapid drawing. I don't want to get too involved in the detail. We're not trying to go and try and get all these flecks or anything. I just want to get the forms really. We're not going to be able to achieve the same tonal range that we've got here. Our blacks won't be as black as this and our whites won't be as white as this. It's just not possible for us to achieve that with charcoal as a medium. But that's fine, because we want our drawing to be reflective of the medium that we're using. And what we'll end up is a drawing which has a slightly, as I say, narrower tonal range. So the first thing we're going to do is to take this drawing and scale up the grid onto the paper that we've got. So I've got my drawing board and I've got my piece of paper ready to go, taped down all of the corners nice and firmly. I've got the image I want to work from. You can see it's been gridded off 10 by 10. So now I need to transfer this grid to the paper at the scale I want it to be. Now I don't want my image to be right up to the edge of the paper. I always want to leave a bit of an edge that allows you to secure the paper to the back of a piece of mount board. It also means you can draw over the edge and have a bit of a bleed, so you don't get a sort of ugly line in your drawing where the mount board meets the image. So I'm going to measure the width of the paper, about 42 centimetres. I want my image, I think, to be about this long, which is about 30 centimetres. So I'm going to use 30 centimetres as the length of my sides of my drawing. And that's quite handy, because 30 divided by 10 is 3 centimetres. So each of my boxes wants to be a 3 centimetre square. So bear with me while I do that now. So that's my paper gridded off, and you're probably thinking that I've just drawn all over my lovely white sheet of paper with a grid and all over the areas that are going to be light. But that doesn't matter, because we don't want to be too precious. One of the main lessons I want to get across to you actually is not to be timid when working with charcoal. Where we need to get rid of these lines in due course, that's fine. We're going to be working this drawing quite a lot back and forwards, so it's absolutely fine to have this grid in charcoal, and we will lose these lines by the end of the drawing. So we're going to use these now to place the main elements of the drawing, and we're literally just going to do a bit of a dot to dot. I'm going to come down, I'm going to use this as my starting point on the left hand pair. I'm 5 down, 2 and a bit across. I'm just going to put a little mark. We don't need to be too accurate with this, but I'm just going to follow it up, sketch in the shape as we go a little bit. It disappears behind that other pair. Kind of comes across there like that, across that corner. You can see this line coming along here. It's not very visible, but I'm just going to bring it along to help us form our shape. You're just judging all the way around where the line intersects those that grid pattern there. If you go wrong at all, that's fine. Just work over it until you're happy with where the line should go. That's okay. Quick check. Now this one here. Don't get too worried about the shape. We just want to get everything more or less in the right place. And we've got our stalk coming out there somewhere. We'll probably lose some of this detail once we start drawing. We'll have to sort of find our way back to it, but that's absolutely fine. Let's just get it roughed in. I'm going to draw fairly rapidly. We're not going to be working this up as a highly detailed drawing. I just really want to get across some of the main lessons about pushing things forward, and or rather pulling things forward and pushing them back. See, I got that line wrong there. That should be here somewhere. Doesn't matter. And the drawing's going to look quite scruffy for a while until we start refining it. But that's most of my key elements. I'm just going to sort of bring this line in here so that we start identifying the form of the pears a little bit. The same with these sort of lines here. And I deliberately chose these slightly gnarled pears. I didn't want sort of perfect symmetrical ones, and that's absolutely fine. So let's get this line a bit straighter. So that's our starting point. We've got the main things blocked in the right place. And now what we're going to do is start blocking in some of the main areas of tonal value. Just come down one square too many, so I'm just going to rectify that by adding another square at the bottom there. I miscounted. Nothing's ever a problem. There you go. Right, we've got our drawing back. Let's wipe that away so I don't get myself confused. Always marking the corners a bit more clearly, because once you start drawing over the edges, it's easy to lose where you are. Right, so now let's look at the main blocks of tonal value. And you can see we've got this much darker background here. It is, however, lighter on this side than this side. If we look carefully, that's because the light was on this side and it was falling off towards the back there. We've got some very deep shadows here. We've got the dark of the wood here. Some more deep shadows here, but it's not all together black. There are some variations within there. We may be able to get some of that, but we're going to be limited because, as I said earlier, our tonal range is much more limited than that of the photo. So let's just start by getting some charcoal onto the paper. And I always think that the sooner you can do that, the better. What we don't want to do is be too precious. So I'm just literally going to work the charcoal in. Now this, I don't know if you could hear that, there are some scratchy bits on this particular piece of charcoal. Every now and again you find a piece or find a bit of your charcoal that isn't quite as soft or indeed as black as another piece. Sometimes the charcoal can be a little bit red or a little bit brown. So sometimes it's worth just swapping out and finding a piece that you like. And I'm just going to hatch this in, and then we're going to work it into the paper with blending stumps. Doesn't matter if I go over the edge slightly, it's absolutely fine. What you can see is that as I'm working, the edge is getting flatter and more pigment is going onto the paper with less effort. I'll come back and do the left-hand edge in a minute. A bit of elbow grease, you can feel this on your arms. Let's come back and do this side. So now I'm just going to take a blending stump. I'm going to start working that into the paper, going into and working in an opposite direction from the direction I've been drawing it. We're just trying to push the charcoal right into the nooks and crannies. You can use hatching strokes, you can use circular strokes, but ultimately you need to really saturate the paper, if you like, with the charcoal particles. And I'm not too worried about the edges at the moment. Some of the edges almost blend into the fruit in any case, and the other ones we're going to define later on. Okay, now I'm going to go the opposite direction. Now we're never going to get rid of all these marks, so I'm not going to worry too much about them. I'm just going to try and get the charcoal into the paper. Right, we'll come back to that in a moment, because what you need to do is get charcoal onto the paper so you've got something to compare the various areas to. I've come down a little bit lower than I meant to there, but that's fine. Let's have a quick look. So we've got that line here at the background there, and that runs right the way through. So we need to just lift some of the charcoal in one or two places. We can do that to a certain extent with the blending stump. Just clean it off on the side of the paper and just lift it off. But we'll use our erasers for that later as well. But that's absolutely fine. We've got then this fairly dark bit of wood, or relatively dark bit of wood. Let's get that roughed in as well. Now you will notice that I'm using a relatively thin piece of charcoal. I'm not using a thick piece, and the reason for that is that thicker pieces of charcoal are more likely to have those little hard, gnarly bits that can scratch the paper. So I always like to use the thinner bits that tend to be a little bit softer. Takes a little bit longer, but it's worth it if you can avoid scratching the paper. Again, just blend it in. Not worrying too much about the tonal variation here at the moment. Let's just get the main blocks of tone onto the paper. You can see that I'm virtually rubbing that line out. I'm just putting some. This is very light, but I'm not drawing it with the charcoal. I'm lifting it off some other bits where I want to remove some, and just carrying it across. And let's just use the charcoal that's already there on the grid lines and what have you. And work them into the paper. Again, I'm deliberately going over the edge of my grid. Let's try and get some of this darker tone in this corner in there, and another layer. Not very happy with that piece. A little bit better. And the paper will only take so much. You can only go so dark. So we're not going to worry about it. That's just the nature of the medium. We're going to embrace that, and our drawing will have a uniquely charcoal drawing flavour to it. So don't worry if you're not achieving exactly the same tonal values as the drawing that you're copying. We're not after a super real or photographic image. We're trying to do a charcoal drawing. I may speed this up in the film in a minute to spare you watching me doing this for hours. Chair out of the way. Okay. Don't worry about if you get accidental marks. As you can see, I'm not being precious with this at all. I'm just blocking it in. I know I can make any bit of this lighter or darker as I want to as the drawing develops. Let's just get a bit of tone on the back end there. And I'm constantly sort of flitting between the blending stump and the charcoal at this stage. And at the end of this process, I don't want any white on the paper whatsoever. I want to get rid of every single bit of white. We might try and get back to white in one or two places for the highlights, but there are very few areas of any drawing that are truly white. So don't be afraid to cover the whole of the drawing with the medium. And quite often when drawing spherical objects like this, it's good practice to actually sort of follow the shape of the object. It just helps to produce that illusion of volume. And you get some of the marks are sort of virtually imperceptibly in line with the contours, but I think the eye picks up on it sometimes. It can just help again to create that illusion of objects in space. You'll find yourself going back over areas you've done over and over again while you get that pigment really worked into the paper. you'll notice that on the shadow there's a sort of very sharp line of shadow, and then there's a slightly less defined line of shadow, and that's absolutely usual. So you've got to look very carefully at the drawings and just constantly ask yourself the question, is that lighter than that or is it darker than that? Does that need to be pulled forward? Does it need to be pushed back? Got this sort of darker piece of wood here I'm going to draw in now. And I'm looking at this dark shadow of the back of here. And I'm not worrying about the fact that it goes pretty much over the edge and that we lose the edge. That's all part of the process with charcoal drawing. In fact, it's one of the nicest things, I think, is when you find boundaries of equal tonal value and you can lose them. A nice way of sort of doing that, if you like, is just to increase the contrast when you do your digital image. The other thing that's really good to do is keep squinting. When you squint, it sort of reduces the amount of light coming into your eye, and it really does accentuate the areas of shadow, and you can see more clearly where the tonal differences are. I love this shadow of this stalk going over the top here. I sort of played with the angle of the light to try and get that in there, and also I pushed them back towards the panel at the back to try and get some shadow along the back as well, which we've achieved. Keep working around the drawing, constantly moving from one place to another, trying to bring the whole drawing up to the same level of finish at all times. I'm not just focusing on one little area and getting tied up in the detail. Hope you can see this and not just the top of my bald head. A little bit tricky to avoid the camera sometimes. Still life drawings are a wonderful way to practice your drawing skills. You can take as long as you like, particularly if you've got an electronic light source and you're not relying on the sunlight, which will shift throughout your drawing session. So you can find that by the end of your drawing session, the light is completely different from how it was when you started. So if you have got an old angle light or a poised angle light, it really helps. And you can see just how much I use the blending stump as a tool both for lifting the charcoal and for applying it. It's a really important tool. It's not just for blending in. It's incredibly useful. Just removing some around that edge there. I've got all this area that I need to lighten up a little bit. Let's just take a little bit of that off there. My eyes are constantly darting between the drawing and the photograph to try and constantly ask myself the question, is that bit lighter or darker than the area around it? So I've got some sort of marks in the wood and what have you. We're not going to try and slavishly copy that, but I do want to just emulate that a little bit with the drawing. Now, there's a nice defined line around this, but we're going to do that with the eraser, not with the blender. So I'm not too worried about getting a very accurate line there. It's much better to take a crisp line up over the background than it is to bring a background up to a sharp line. Got some sort of curves here in the wood. Again, I don't need to slavishly copy them, I just scratch a few bits in. As we blend away, those will just give that sort of slight hint of what's going on there. More or less lost them there, but we'll get them back in at some point. Same with the wooden board that this is sitting on here. There are sort of grain marks in there, so we can just, again, it's just hints really. We don't want to slavishly copy it centimetre by centimetre, but they all go in more or less the same direction. We just want to provide some visual interest, really break up the monotony of the large areas of relatively similar tonal value. So every now and again, just take a step back, have a little look, squint again. I can see instantly that I've got much too much light on this side. Need to turn that right back. And because these are spherical forms, they conform to all to light on all spherical forms. I can't say it now. The light will drop off as it comes around the back. But what we will find is that some strange things happen sometimes. So, for example, here the light is coming from the right. It gets darker as it goes towards back. But then you've got a lighter area again, where the light is reflected off this pair and back onto that one. So it's really worth looking very, very carefully, and don't make any assumptions. You'll find that light does quite unexpected things sometimes. And I like the fact that sometimes things are a little bit obscure. It's not always really obvious at first glance that an object is what you think it is. So I don't care that if someone looks at a drawing and they have to sort of work it out. I think that's makes the drawing all the more interesting. So I love these sort of high contrast, slightly chiaroscuro, dark light drawings. So you can see I'm working pretty fast. Normally I would take my time a little bit more, but we've got limited time for this exercise, and we don't need to be perfectionist about this. I'm just after an impression. Again, still too much light on this side. Add a bit more pigment. Accentuate that form. Also got more shade over the top there, so I'm just bringing that in there. And that also helps produce the illusion of this spherical form here as it comes round. Again, using the blending stump to pull the medium off the paper. It's almost like using a paintbrush. Let's come back to this one. I've lost the shape slightly, so I'm going to try and define that a little bit more. So as you're working on this at home, just practice using the blending stump for moving the charcoal around the drawing. Interestingly, just on this side, the edge of the pear is a little bit darker than the background. Just lighten that a little bit. Like I said earlier, I'm not too worried about getting rid of all the marks, but I do want it reasonably even. So I'm going to keep working the background a bit. So let's have another little look, see how we're doing. I want to get some of this shadow in here again. I've lost that a bit. That's it, starting to take shape. Some very dark shadow there, and this little corner of light. Actually wiping the charcoal off this little area that should be a bit lighter. If you get it too dark, just rub it off. If you rub off too much, add a bit more charcoal. It's as simple as that, and you just continue this process for as long as it takes to get everything more or less balanced out. And as I said earlier, keep asking yourself the question, is this bit lighter or darker than that bit? Well, we know that it's darker. We can see that. Got to lighten up this edge here, and or darken up this edge here. Get rid of that bit of white. And you can see that what started out as being very scruffy, although it's still a bit scruffy, is starting to take some, to become a little bit more clear. It has a little bit more clarity about it. I'm not worrying about the fact my charcoal's pretty blunt. Let me see what's going on here. So much darker at the top than it is at the bottom. Let's see if we can capture that a little bit. Some really deep shadow behind there. We may not be able to get it quite dark enough, but let's try. Blowing very gently, trying not to get any moisture on there. So, how are we doing? Definitely a bit more here required. More here. Now, this piece is a little bit too short now for what I want to do. I want to put charcoal very lightly on the surface. So I want a longer piece. I want to hold it nearer the end, just so I can gently work it in like that. And just enjoy the mark making as well. You know, it doesn't have to be perfectly smooth. Just enjoy the quality of the cross hatching a little bit, just sneaking in. And this is interesting because it moves from being dark against light background to light against dark background, all in one small area. So we're going to try and achieve that. What I'd like to do is get as far as I can without starting to introduce erasers. And the reason for that is because the erasers can sometimes actually leave a sort of residue on the paper that then becomes like a magnet for the charcoal, so it becomes harder to get back to white. So we're going to use them quite sparingly. I'm being a bit more accurate about where I'm putting my marks now. I'm looking really quite carefully, trying to get a bit of an edge. I want to try and start drawing out some of the features. I'm going to tackle the stalks in a moment. Working now with my mark making along the same sort of line as the grain of the wood. Still need to resolve this area here, which is much lighter, where I've got my charcoal in the wrong place, but that's fine. Let's revert to a sort of eraser here. Just pull it off. And I'm wiping the eraser as I use it. I'm not pushing too hard, I'm just really trying to lift it off. I'm not trying to rub it into the paper and remove everything that's there. An eraser can be used to both remove charcoal but also to push it around, or to actually push it further into the paper. And we can use this now to emulate some of this grain as well. I've got a lighter bit here that at the moment is a little bit too dark. Just put it over the edge. I need to put a little bit more pressure on it, so it's being a bit stubborn. That's fine. And a broader, flatter eraser will help you avoid taking too much off. We can revert, or we will revert shortly, to a smaller eraser. We're entering the phase of what I refer to as sharpening up. We're just now starting to define our areas of shadow and edges a bit more clearly. A bit more carefully as well. to after quite a painterly quality. Using the flat of the eraser here. It's just skimming along the top of the paper. Now just sort of lifting slightly in some of the areas where the light is falling more obviously. These are not our lightest highlights, but they are the sort of, I'm after now defining the sort of lighter areas. You can see how swiftly I'm working. I'm not dwelling on this too much. If you want to get a higher degree of accuracy, you can do that. You can take a bit more time, but that's not what I'm after here now. So I'm pretty pleased with the way that's starting to look. I'm going to do a bit of sharpening up now, and then I'm going to take a break and come back to it fresh and take a look at it from a distance, and then do my final sort of sharpening up and tweaks and what have you. So what we need to do before then though is start defining the edges a little bit more, because at the moment everything's sort of blurring into the background and we've got some quite sharp edges that need to be defined. So I'm looking for a suitable eraser. I'm going to use this clutch eraser. Just taking the edge off it. I don't want to press too hard again, I just want to define the edge of the pear against the background in space. Same with this one. You can see already it's starting to make the whole thing a little bit more crisp. I'm looking for those little highlights around the drawing. I've gone a little bit dark in a couple of places. This is that edge I was talking about earlier where it's sort of lighter in the background there. Darker than the background just next to it. Now normally I take several hours over a drawing like this. I'm sort of rushing a bit so that you don't have to watch paint dry, but I'm hoping that just by watching me work you're starting to get a feel for how you sort of use the tools and go through this process of constantly, as I said before, pushing things to the back and pulling them to the fore. You don't have to make it obvious for the observer. You don't have to draw a line around everything for them to be able to tell what's going on. It's perfectly okay for bits of the edge to merge into other bits of the edge. I use my very thin eraser here now just to start defining the stalk. It comes down to the edge a bit more, doesn't it? And then we have this one, which is sort of darker on one edge. I don't think this bit of charcoal is going to do it for me. Let's have a look. That's a bit better. I think this is a fun bit really, where you start adding the detail a bit and the whole thing just starts to come together. Just trying to get this area of this pear here as accurate as I can before I draw the stalk on it. This one more. Very similar tonal values on this edge here. Virtually blend into each other again. I'm going to take advantage of that and bring that across. But it does mean that we then need to differentiate this edge here a little bit more. Looking at these high highlights as well now. Start to define those. Now let's get this, first let's do this edge here. Let's just tidy this up a little bit and then we'll do this lighter edge against the dark. putting it very, very gently. I don't want to change anything too much. Again, I'm just going to cut the end of this eraser so we can start working on this a bit. This is a tricky one really, because bits of this are a little bit darker than the background, ever so slightly. And then bits of it are a bit lighter. So I'm going to call it a day there for the moment, and I'm going to go away, take a little break, and then come back with a fresh set of eyes before I do my final tweaks and sharpening up. So I've just come back to my drawing after a break. I've propped this up. I should just make this point right now that if you are doing a drawing, it's preferable to work with a drawing upright on an easel. I've not done that today simply because it's easier to get the camera up above so you can see what I'm doing. But normally I would like to do that, and then the dust tends to fall away rather than sitting on the surface and you have to blow it away. I've got the image here. I'm reasonably happy with it, but there are a few things I would like to tweak, and that's going to take a little bit of time. I'm going to take maybe another half hour or so, just doing a bit more blending, a bit more tweaking, putting a little bit more detail in. But really it's just a case of repeating all of the things that I've talked about so far. Just looking very carefully, identifying which areas are lighter or darker than others, and gradually either knocking them back or bringing them forward. So I'm going to do that now, and I'm going to speed the process up so you can see what I've done, but without having to watch through every little bit. So let's get going. So I'm going to check that again now. Just tapping off any loose particles. I'm going to prop that up, have a look at it, and see if there's anything else I want to do before we start fixing. But I'm pretty happy with that now. We're pretty well where I want it to be. I don't want it to be too refined. I want it to be quite sketchy. I want it to look like a drawing. I could go on I could spend hours refining and refining and refining to make it more and more smooth and photographic in quality, but that's for this exercise, that's plenty. We've got the form coming out, we've been pushing the shadows back, pushing the objects into the background in parts and bring them to the fore in other parts. We've been looking at the lines, trying to work out which are our hard lines and which are our soft lines. And I say, when I say hard lines, I mean those lines that stand out against the background, and which are the ones that sort of merge into the background. I'm happy that we've really pretty much achieved that aim. I love the fact that parts of the drawing more or less just literally disappear into the background, and that there's no boundary line between the object and the space behind. I've got some nice highlights going on, some nice contrast. So I think that's us. One last look, and then we can take it outside and prepare it for fixing. So now I've come outside and I'm going to fix the drawing with fixative. This is a general purpose fixative. You can get special fixatives that enable you to fix and then work over the top to build up the tonal values, but this is just a general one, as you can see, suitable for working in various dry medium, and we're going to use this just to seal off the drawing and make sure that it doesn't smudge and smear too easily. Even though we will have fixed it by the end of this process, you still need to be careful not to accidentally rub it, and you need to treat it with care, but this will certainly help preserve it. So the first thing to do is to essentially make sure there are no little particles of charcoal still sitting on the surface, or bits of razor debris, and a good thing to do is just to tap the board quite vigorously. That will knock off any of the larger particles, and then just take a really good look and see if you can see anything, and that looks pretty clear to me. So I'm going to take my fixative, and the idea is to mist it on, and I don't want to saturate it, I don't want too much of the fixative on there, I just want to mist on the first coat very, very lightly, and I'm a good probably 2 feet away from the drawing, and I'm also about 2 feet to the side, so I'm going to spray it forwards and then it will drift down. And I'm working from side to side, and that's it for the first coat. So don't be tempted to go mad with the fix, just be patient, and what you want is several thin layers like that, not one great big thick liquidy layer that's going to affect your drawing. Let's do another layer now, and we can get a little bit closer and put a little bit more of the fix on. So I'm just passing over it a little bit more slowly. Again in a sort of horizontal pattern, and I'm going to leave that again for a few minutes. Final coat now, and I'm going to go again a little bit closer, and I'm going to go in an opposite direction, and again I'm going to leave that for a few minutes before I do anything else. So here's the final drawing, and I just remind everyone that we've produced this using purely a couple of sticks of charred wood and some rudimentary tools. We haven't used any compressed charcoal or white pigment. The white is purely the paper, the colour of the paper coming through, and the dark tones are where we've built up the charcoal in layers and really worked it into the paper, so we build up those very deep dark greys. By way of summary, I just want to say a few things. The first is, just don't be timid when working with charcoal. It can be quite intimidating if you have a pristine sheet of white paper, but just get the medium onto the paper and worry about the detail later on. So block it out, work it into the paper. Don't worry if initially you get an area too light or too dark. You can always lighten something up or darken it later. The main thing is to work the whole drawing up at the same sort of rate, And it will look quite scruffy initially, and you will rectify that as you go on. And in fact, there is very little you can't rectify as you go. So throw yourself into it, use the tools that you've got effectively to manipulate the charcoal. Remember that blending stumps and erasers are very useful for not just for blending and erasing, but you can also smudge and smear and move the charcoal around the paper with those. And think a lot about the pressure that you apply when you're working as well. At times you're going to be working very, very vigorously and really pushing hard into the paper, and at others you probably just want to have the lightest touch over the top of the paper. Look really hard into areas of shade and shadow. You'll often find unexpected things going on there where light is bouncing around. And just analyse the drawing all the time as you go and ask yourself that question repeatedly. Is this bit I'm working on now lighter or darker than the adjoining area? Is this area of the drawing lighter or darker than this or that? And you're just making constant comparisons and either pushing it back or pulling it forward. So that brings us to the end of the workshop today. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you feel it's been worthwhile. If you're interested in taking your charcoal drawing any further, please feel free to check out my book, which is called Charcoal Techniques and Tutorials for the Complete Beginner. It's published by the Guild of Master Craftsmen, and it's available through Amazon and most good booksellers. In it there are 10 new tutorials, including a closer look at compressed charcoal and observational drawing and a whole host of other things we haven't been able to cover today. Also, please feel free to check out my website, which is www.richardrochester.co.uk, where you can see other examples of my work, including some work on a very large scale. So thank you again. See you next time.